I'm a 36-year-old guy, married with 2 kids, one's 7 and the other is 4. Life is already hectic with a full-time job and 2 young kids running around the house. So when my phone buzzed late one night, I had a bad feeling right away. I saw it was my parents calling, and I knew it wasn't going to be good news. It wasn't the usual just checking in kind of call. My mom's voice was shaky, and after a few seconds of awkward small talk, she got straight to the point. My younger brother, who's 29, was in trouble. Again. He had lost his job, was deep in debt, and was about to be evicted from his apartment. My mom said he had nowhere to go and asked if he could stay with us for a while. My heart sank. I'd heard this story too many times before. My brother has always been a bit of a disaster. Growing up, he was the kid who could never stay out of trouble, always getting into fights, hanging out with the wrong crowd, and generally just making things difficult for everyone. As an adult, it didn't get much better. He's been in and out of jobs, mostly because of his own bad decisions. And when he wasn't losing jobs, he was losing money, gambling, drinking, who knows what else. I lost count of how many times he's borrowed money from me and never paid it back. So, when my parents asked if he could stay with us, it wasn't exactly a surprise. But it wasn't something I wanted to deal with either. I already had my hands full with my own family. My wife and I both work full-time jobs, and between the bills, the mortgage, daycare for our youngest, and extracurriculars for the oldest, we're stretched thin. Not just financially, but mentally and emotionally too. I didn't respond to my mom's request right away. I just listened as she went on about how bad things were for my brother and how he didn't have anyone else to turn to. Then she pulled out the big guns, family responsibility. She reminded me that family is supposed to help each other and that my brother just needs a little support right now. I knew what she was doing. My parents have always been good at the emotional guilt trip, especially when it comes to my brother. No matter how many times he screws up, they always find a way to make it seem like it's my responsibility to help him get back on his feet. While my mom was talking, I couldn't help but think about how much time and energy it takes just to keep my own family afloat. My kids are at that age where they need constant attention. My wife and I are always juggling playdates, school events, and work projects. The thought of adding my brother, with all his baggage, into that chaos seemed like a recipe for disaster. And I knew my wife would feel the same way. She's been through this with me before. A few years ago, my brother stayed with us for a couple of weeks, and it was a nightmare. He didn't pay rent, left messes everywhere, and even borrowed some things that mysteriously disappeared when he moved out. We barely got through that situation without it blowing up our marriage. As expected, my wife wasn't on board when I told her about the call. She didn't even hesitate. Absolutely not, she said, and I couldn't blame her. She's seen how my brother operates. He comes in, makes a mess of everything, and then leaves us to clean it up, both literally and figuratively. I went back to the phone, and my mom wasn't happy with my hesitation. She started to push harder, saying that they couldn't handle him anymore and that it was our turn to step up. Then she hit me with the final blow, my dad's health. Apparently, the stress of dealing with my brother was making things worse for him, and they didn't know how much longer they could manage on their own. That one hurt. My dad has had health issues for a while now, and hearing that this situation might be making things worse put me in a tough spot. I felt like I was being backed into a corner. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. My brother was never going to change, and bringing him into my home would only make things worse for my family. After I hung up the phone, I sat in the dark for a while, trying to process everything. I could hear my kids snoring softly down the hall, and I knew that whatever decision I made, it would impact them too. I didn't want to let my parents down, but I couldn't ignore the fact that my first responsibility was to my wife and kids. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see my brother's face, hear my parents' pleading voices, and feel the weight of the decision I had to make. I knew I couldn't keep putting it off, but I also knew that whatever I decided, someone was going to get hurt. In the end, it felt like no matter what I chose, it was going to be a disaster waiting to happen. And as the sun came up the next morning, I was no closer to a solution than I had been the night before. All I knew was that things were about to get messy, and there was no easy way out. Update 1. The next morning, after another night of barely any sleep, I knew I couldn't avoid my brother any longer. My parents had already made it clear they expected me to step up, but I wanted to hear it straight from him. Maybe he'd surprise me. Maybe this time, he'd own up to his mistakes and show some responsibility. So I called him. He answered after a few rings, sounding groggy like he'd just woken up, even though it was almost noon. I didn't beat around the bush. I asked him what was going on, why he'd lost his job, and how things had gotten so bad that he was about to be evicted. His response wasn't surprising, but still managed to irritate me. He brushed it off, saying his boss had it out for him and that the landlord was being unreasonable. According to him, none of it was his fault. He said he'd been unlucky with the job, and the eviction was because his landlord was a jerk, not because he hadn't paid rent for months. He went on about how everyone's always against him, how things just never go his way. I asked him what his plan was. He paused for a moment, then said, "Well, I guess I'll come stay with you for a bit until I get back on my feet." Just like that, like it was already a done deal. No apology, no asking if it was okay, just an assumption that I'd take him in because, in his mind, that's what family does. It was clear he hadn't changed. He still wasn't taking any responsibility for his situation, still blaming everyone else for his problems, and still thinking it was someone else's job to clean up his mess. I told him I'd have to talk it over with my wife before making any decisions, which he didn't seem to take seriously. He just said, "Yeah, okay, whatever. Let me know when I can move in." When I told my wife about the call, she was even more against the idea than before. She pointed out that he hadn't even asked for help properly, He just expected us to take him in. She reminded me of the last time he stayed with us and how it had nearly destroyed our peace at home. And with two young kids, she didn't want that kind of chaos in the house again. She was firm if he moved in, it would only make things worse for everyone, especially for her. She didn't want to risk her mental health by dealing with my brother's drama on top of everything else we already had going on. While I was still trying to figure out what to do, my parents called again. This time they weren't as gentle. They said they'd raised both of us, that they'd done everything for us growing up, and now it was time for me to give back. They made it sound like it was my duty to take my brother in, no matter what. It was all about family loyalty, how I couldn't just turn my back on him. The pressure was mounting, and I could feel the walls closing in. Meanwhile, the stress was starting to seep into other parts of my life. My oldest kid, who's 7, picked up on the tension right away. They asked me if everything was okay, and I didn't have the heart to lie, but I also didn't know how to explain the situation without making things worse. I could see the worry on their face, and it made me even more anxious about what kind of example I was setting for them. At work, things weren't any better. My boss had started piling more projects on me, and I was already feeling overwhelmed. It was like everything was happening at once, and I didn't know how I was supposed to handle it all. Between the stress at home and the pressure at work, I felt like I was drowning. To make matters worse, my brother decided to air our family's dirty laundry on social media. He posted some long, self-pitying rant about how his family wasn't stepping up to help him in his time of need, making it sound like we were abandoning him. He didn't mention how he'd gotten himself into this mess or that he wasn't taking responsibility for anything. He just made us all look heartless, and of course some extended family members took his side. I started getting texts and calls from aunts and cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, all of them telling me I needed to help my brother. Some were subtle, some not so much, but the message was clear. I was the bad guy if I didn't let him move in. It felt like everyone was against me, and the resentment started to build. I was angry at my brother for causing this mess, at my parents for pushing me into it, and at my extended family for getting involved without knowing the whole story. The only real support I had was from my wife's family. They saw how stressed we were and offered to help with the kids more often, which was a huge relief. But they made it clear they didn't want anything to do with my brother. They understood our situation and knew that taking him in would only bring more problems. Their support was helpful, but it didn't solve the problem at hand. Then came the ultimatum from my parents. They called again, this time with a new twist. Either I take my brother in, or they would cut off all financial and emotional support. That hit hard. They helped pay for some of the kids' daycare costs, which we rely on. Losing that support would put us in a tight spot financially, and they knew it. As the days went by, I found myself losing more and more sleep, replaying all the conversations in my head. I felt trapped between my loyalty to my parents and my responsibility to protect my own family. Every option felt like it would lead to disaster, and I knew I couldn't put off the decision much longer. Update 2. A few days after the ultimatum from my parents, things went from bad to worse. I hadn't made a decision yet, still trying to figure out how to handle the situation without blowing up my life, but apparently my brother didn't think waiting was necessary. It was a Friday evening. The kids were playing in the living room, and my wife and I were just about to start dinner when there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find my brother standing there, bags in hand, with a casual "Hey, I'm here." No warning, no heads up. He just showed up, fully expecting to move in like it was a done deal. I could feel my heart drop. I barely had a second to process before my wife came to the door, saw him, and immediately lost it. She asked him what he was doing here, and my brother, completely oblivious to the tension, shrugged and said he had nowhere else to go. That's when things exploded. My wife was furious. She reminded him that we hadn't agreed to anything, and that he couldn't just show up unannounced and expect to stay. My brother, always the victim, acted shocked and hurt, like we were the ones being unreasonable. He started saying he didn't have anywhere else to go, that it was just for a few days until he figured things out. But my wife wasn't having it. She told him straight up that this wasn't going to happen. The argument got louder. The kids, who had been in the living room, came to see what was going on. They stood there, wide-eyed, watching their parents and uncle shouting at each other. My oldest asked, "Why is everyone so mad?" And I felt a knot in my stomach. This wasn't just affecting me and my wife anymore, this was bleeding into the kids' lives. My brother refused to leave. He said he couldn't go back to his place because he was being evicted, and no one else in the family would take him in. My wife was fuming, and at that point she gave me an ultimatum. If he stayed, she and the kids were leaving. She couldn't take the stress anymore, and she wasn't going to let our family get dragged down by my brother's chaos. I was stuck. My brother was standing there, my wife was packing up the kids' things, and I didn't know what to do. And then, as if things weren't bad enough, my parents showed up. Apparently my brother had called them when he arrived, and they had driven over to sort things out. When they came in, the confrontation escalated. My parents immediately took my brother's side, saying how we were being heartless by not letting him stay. My mom went on about how hard things had been for him, and how he just needed some time to get back on his feet. My dad, looking frustrated, said I should have more compassion for my brother. Then, they turned on my wife. They accused her of controlling me, of turning me against my family. They said she was the reason I wasn't helping, that she was selfish for not wanting to support family. My wife was livid, and another round of shouting broke out. I stood there, torn between my parents, my wife, and my brother, all of them yelling at once. It felt like the house was going to implode. My brother acted all innocent in front of my parents, putting on his sweet face, saying he didn't mean to cause trouble, that he just didn't have anywhere else to go. But when my parents weren't looking, he shot my wife and me a smug look, like he knew he was winning this battle. The manipulation was crystal clear. The kids, already upset by the argument, started acting out at home and school. I got a call from the school asking me to come in for a meeting about my oldest's behavior. They said they'd noticed a sudden change, like my kid was anxious and distracted, acting out in class. It was a gut punch, knowing that all of this mess was starting to affect my kids in ways I hadn't anticipated. On top of that, work was becoming a nightmare. I was dropping the ball on deadlines and projects, and my boss called me in for a talk. He wasn't happy with my performance and made it clear that I needed to get things together. The stress from home was spilling into every part of my life, and it felt like everything was unraveling. Meanwhile, my brother posted another rant on social media, painting me and my wife as the villains. He wrote about how he was homeless because his own family wouldn't take him in, twisting the truth to make himself look like the victim. The post blew up, and soon I was getting messages from distant relatives, some siding with him, others telling me I needed to do the right thing and help him out. My extended family started picking sides, and the whole situation turned into a family-wide drama. Some relatives stopped talking to me altogether, while others tried to guilt me into taking him in. It was chaos. One night, after another massive argument, my wife had had enough. She packed up the kids and left to stay with her parents for a few days. She told me she couldn't keep living like this, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. She needed space, and so did the kids. For the first time in days, the house was quiet. My brother was still there, but the absence of my wife and kids made everything feel empty and wrong. I realized, standing alone in that house, that my life was spiraling out of control because of my brother. I didn't know how things had gotten this bad, but I knew something had to change before I lost everything that actually mattered to me. Update 3. After my wife and kids left, the house was painfully quiet. I sat in the living room, just staring at the empty space where their laughter and chaos usually filled the air. It was suffocating. My brother was still in the guest room, probably lounging on his phone, while my life outside those walls was crumbling. That night, with nobody around to distract me, I broke down. For the first time in years, I realized just how much control I'd lost over my own life. I was stuck between my parents, my brother, and my own family, trying to make everyone happy but failing at all fronts. My brother had wormed his way into my home, my wife had taken the kids, and I felt powerless. After what seemed like hours of sitting in the dark, I decided that things couldn't go on like this. The next morning, fueled by a mixture of exhaustion and frustration, I confronted my brother. I told him straight up, staying here indefinitely wasn't an option. He needed to figure something else out. As expected, he didn't take it well. He launched into his usual routine, playing the victim, saying that life had been unfair to him, and that family was supposed to stick together. He even tried to pull the guilt card, saying I was the only person who could help him, but I wasn't buying it anymore. I reminded him that he'd been in situations like this before, several times in fact, and every single time, it was someone else who had to pick up the pieces. He refused to take any responsibility for the mess he'd made, and I wasn't going to let him drag me down with him this time. I stood firm, but my brother didn't budge. He claimed he had nowhere to go and that if I kicked him out, he'd be on the streets. Later that day, my parents called again. This time, they weren't just pushing guilt, they were making threats. If I didn't let my brother stay, they'd cut off all financial support immediately. That hit me hard. They helped with some of the daycare costs for my kids, and losing that would put a huge strain on our already tight budget. But I knew what this was, another manipulation tactic to get their way. It made me furious, but it also made me realize just how trapped I was in this web they'd spun around me. I called my wife and told her everything, about the threats from my parents and how my brother was refusing to leave. She didn't waver. She said that either my brother was out or she and the kids wouldn't come back. It was that simple. For the first time in days, I felt like I had some clarity. I couldn't lose my wife and kids over this. My brother had made his choices, and I had to make mine. Out of nowhere, one of my aunts reached out. I hadn't spoken to her in a while, but she'd been watching the whole situation unfold from the sidelines. She told me that she'd dealt with similar issues with my brother years ago. He had manipulated her too, pulling the same stunts he was now, but she had been too afraid to speak up back then. She told me what I already knew deep down. Enabling my brother wasn't helping him, and it was time to prioritize my own family. Her support gave me the final push I needed. That evening, I got another call from my wife. She told me that she had spoken to a lawyer. If my brother refused to leave, we might need to consider legal action to get him out of the house. That shook me. I hadn't realized things could escalate to that level, but it became clear how far this situation had spiraled out of control. My brother was turning my life upside down, and it had to stop. Over the next couple of days, my brother must have sensed the walls closing in. He started making promises again, saying he was applying to jobs and would find a place soon. But I'd heard it all before, too many times to count. He was stalling, hoping I'd cave, but I was done with the empty promises. I gave him a 2-week deadline. He needed to be out of the house by then, no exceptions. I also told him that I wouldn't be responsible for him financially anymore. If he couldn't manage on his own, that wasn't my problem. When my parents found out, they were livid. They accused me of abandoning my brother, of turning my back on the family. But this time, their words didn't shake me. I had my own family to protect, and I was done letting guilt and manipulation control me. In the days leading up to the deadline, my brother tried one final plea. He broke down in tears, saying that if I kicked him out, he'd be homeless. He begged for more time, for one last chance. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt, but then I reminded myself of the havoc he had caused. This wasn't my responsibility anymore. My wife and kids came back home after I reassured her that I had set a firm boundary with my brother. But she made it clear, if he wasn't gone by the end of the 2 weeks, she and the kids would leave again for good. The tension was thick in the house. Every day felt like a ticking clock, waiting to see if my brother would actually follow through and leave, or if he would try to drag this out even further. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of control, but I knew the waiting game wasn't over yet. The next few days would determine whether I could get my life back on track or if this nightmare would continue. Update 4. As the 2-week deadline for my brother to move out crept closer, the tension in the house started to build again. My brother hadn't made any moves to leave. Instead, he spent most of his time sulking around the house, acting like the world had wronged him. His passive-aggressive comments started to get under my skin. Every now and then, he'd mutter things like, "Well, guess I'll just be homeless soon," or "It's clear nobody in this family cares about each other anymore." He made it a point to mention how family is supposed to stick together, casting himself as the victim in the worst way possible. Meanwhile, my parents had gone radio silent. After their last threat about cutting off financial support, they stopped calling. Normally, they'd check in every few days, whether to ask about the kids or remind me of some family obligation, but now there was nothing. Part of me felt relieved, like I could breathe without their constant pressure. But another part of me, the part that's always been trained to seek their approval, felt guilty. Still, I knew it was another tactic to punish me for not giving in. Silent treatment instead of the usual guilt trip. With my wife back home, things were calmer between us. She could see I was finally standing up to my brother and parents, and I could tell she was proud of me for it. She offered to take over more of the day-to-day stuff with the kids, giving me space to handle everything else. The fact that she was back in the house, willing to stay as long as I stuck to my decision, lifted a massive weight off my shoulders. But my brother? He wasn't done playing games. He started reaching out to other family members, spinning the story to make me and my wife look like the villains. I began receiving texts and calls from aunts, cousins, and even distant relatives, all saying the same thing, that I was selfish, that I lacked compassion, that family should always come first. These people hadn't been involved in our lives for years, but now they had opinions on how I was treating my brother. I wasn't alone in this, though. The aunt who had first reached out, the one who'd had her own run-ins with my brother, continued to be a source of support. She checked in regularly, reminding me to stay focused on what really mattered, my wife and kids. Her words kept me grounded when everything else was trying to pull me back into the chaos. As the days passed, it became painfully obvious that my brother wasn't making any effort to find a new place to stay or a job. He spent most of his time lounging around, glued to his phone or the TV, as if the deadline I'd given him didn't exist. It confirmed what I had already suspected. He had no intention of leaving unless he was forced out. With the deadline just days away, my wife reminded me of her ultimatum. She made it clear that if my brother wasn't gone by the end of the week, she and the kids would leave again, and this time, it would be for good. I realized then that this was my last shot. If I didn't follow through, I would lose everything that mattered to me. I confronted my brother one final time. I asked him directly if he had found a place to go, and as usual, he dodged the question, shifting the blame onto everything but himself. He claimed that his mental health was making it impossible for him to make progress, and that the stress of being kicked out was only making things worse. It was another manipulation, plain and simple. He'd used the same excuse before to get out of tough situations, and I wasn't falling for it anymore. On the night before the deadline, my brother pulled one final stunt. He claimed he had found a friend's couch to crash on but needed more time to make arrangements. It was yet another excuse to buy himself more time, and I saw right through it. I told him flat out that the deadline wasn't changing. He had to be out by the next day, no exceptions. That night, things escalated again on social media. My brother posted a dramatic update, painting himself as the poor, abandoned sibling being thrown out by his own family. More relatives jumped into the fray, messaging me with even more accusations of betraying family and not caring about my brother's well-being. The drama had reached a whole new level, and I was the target of all of it. Then, on the morning of the deadline, my parents called one last time. Their tone was desperate. They begged me to reconsider, saying they were too old to deal with this kind of stress, and that my brother's life would be ruined if I forced him out. They pleaded with me to give him more time, to let him stay until he got back on his feet. It was the same old song and dance, but the stakes felt higher this time. For a moment, I almost caved. The weight of their words, combined with the pressure from the rest of the family, had me second-guessing myself. Maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe I should give him one more chance. But then my wife stepped in. She reminded me of why we had drawn the line in the first place, why we couldn't keep enabling my brother's behavior at the cost of our own family's happiness. Her calm, rational words cut through the noise in my head, and I knew she was right. This wasn't just about my brother anymore. It was about protecting the life we had built, about making sure our kids grew up in a stable, healthy environment. And with that, I made my decision. My brother had to go, no matter what. I was finally ready to hold the line. Update 5. The deadline day arrived, and I was bracing myself for whatever drama my brother might bring. True to form, he didn't pack up his things the night before or show any sign of leaving. But by mid-morning, after another heated argument, he finally accepted that he had no choice. There was no more time to buy, no more excuses to make. He called a friend who agreed to let him crash on their couch temporarily. It was clear he was angry, throwing things into his bags, slamming doors, making snide comments like, "Guess this is how family treats each other now." As he walked out the door, he didn't even look back. He made it clear that he felt betrayed, abandoned by the people he thought would always be there to pick him up when he fell. Once he left, the house felt different, almost instantly. The tension that had been hanging over everything for weeks disappeared, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a sense of peace. I stood in the doorway for a moment, letting the quiet settle in. There was no more yelling, no more drama, just calm. I felt an immense sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. My kids, who had been tense and irritable throughout the whole ordeal, seemed to pick up on the change too. Later that day, my eldest came up to me and said, "The house feels less angry now." That hit me hard. I hadn't realized just how deeply my brother's presence and all the conflict had affected them. It made me even more sure that I'd made the right decision. The kids were finally able to relax again, and so was I. My wife, who had been steadfast throughout this whole ordeal, gave me a quiet smile that said everything. She appreciated that I had finally stood up to my brother and my parents, putting our family first. It wasn't just about getting my brother out of the house, it was about setting boundaries and protecting what we had built together. Our marriage felt stronger because of it, like we were finally on the same page after all the chaos. Of course, my parents weren't as happy. They kept their promise of going silent, except for the occasional passive-aggressive text. I didn't expect them to be thrilled about how things turned out, but the cold shoulder stung a little. Still, I preferred the silence over their constant pressure and manipulation. It was a small price to pay for the peace we'd gained. Unsurprisingly, my brother didn't stay quiet for long. He took to social media again, posting another round of updates about how he'd been kicked out by his own family, painting himself as the victim. He left out all the details about his own irresponsibility and manipulations, of course. It was the same story as before, but now more of our extended family chimed in, taking sides. Some of my relatives, mostly those who had been distant for years, continued to send me messages, accusing me of abandoning my brother. Others, though, finally reached out in support. Some had heard the full story from my aunt, who had been quietly defending me behind the scenes, and they commended me for standing up for my own family. The family was divided, but I no longer felt the need to justify myself to anyone. I knew the truth, and so did the people closest to me. Just as I had predicted, my brother ran into more problems almost immediately after leaving. Within a few weeks, he was kicked out of his friend's place. From what I heard through the grapevine, it was the same story all over again. He didn't contribute, didn't help out, and expected to be taken care of. Predictably, he turned to my parents, who, despite everything, still took him back in. It was frustrating to see them continue enabling him, but by that point, I was done getting involved. His problems were no longer mine to solve. In the past, I would have felt guilty. I would have questioned whether I was doing the right thing, whether I should step in to help him again. But this time, it was different. I didn't feel the same weight of responsibility I once did. I knew my brother had to face the consequences of his own choices, and for the first time in years, I wasn't going to carry the burden for him. That realization brought a strange kind of freedom, the kind I hadn't felt in a long time. With my brother finally out of our lives, I noticed a significant change in my mental health. The constant stress, the anxiety of waiting for the next disaster, all of it faded away. I slept better, I was more focused at work, and I was more present with my wife and kids. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living my own life, not just reacting to my brother's chaos. The peace in our home was something I hadn't realized we were missing until we got it back. My aunt, who had been my quiet supporter throughout this whole ordeal, reached out again, congratulating me for taking control of the situation. She reminded me that I had made the right choice, that standing up for my own family wasn't something to feel guilty about. Her words reinforced what I had come to understand, that sometimes protecting your own happiness means walking away from the people who bring you down, even if they're family. In the end, I knew I couldn't change my brother or my parents. They would continue their patterns, but I didn't have to be a part of it anymore. My priority was, and always would be, my wife and kids. And for the first time, I was completely okay with that. I'm a 25-year-old guy, and I work in IT. It's not the most exciting job in the world, but it pays well. And I've always been good with money. Ever since I started working right out of college, I made sure to save, budget, and plan for the future. I don't splurge, I don't live beyond my means, and I don't make dumb financial decisions. But apparently, that just makes me a walking ATM to my family. Growing up, money was always tight. My parents lived paycheck to paycheck, always scraping by but never really getting ahead. It wasn't like we were starving or anything, but there were a lot of not this month, and maybe next time conversations whenever I asked for something extra. I learned early on that if I wanted something, I had to work for it. My younger sister, on the other hand, got a very different experience. She's 22 now and in college. Unlike me, she never had a job, not even a summer one. My parents always made sure she had what she wanted, even if it meant stretching their budget thin. The reasoning was always the same. She's focused on school. She shouldn't have to worry about money. When I got my first full-time job, my parents sat me down for what I thought was a "we're proud of you" talk. Instead, they told me that since I was now making a steady income, I should help out by giving a portion of my paycheck to my sister, not for rent or bills, just to support her. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. They asked for 10% of my paycheck to go directly to her for things like textbooks, groceries, and general college expenses. I didn't love the idea, but I figured, okay, she's my sister and college is expensive. Plus, I could afford it. For the first few months, I didn't think much about it. I transferred the money like clockwork, assuming she was using it for school-related expenses. But then, little things started adding up. She'd show up at family gatherings wearing brand new designer clothes. She posted pictures on Instagram, showing off expensive meals and weekend trips, all while still complaining about how hard it was to be a full-time student with no financial support. I casually asked her about school, trying to get a sense of how the money was helping, and she'd brush it off with vague answers. One day, I decided to test something. I asked her if she wanted me to buy her textbooks directly instead of giving her the money. She laughed and said, "Oh, I already got them," even though I knew she hadn't. That's when it clicked. She wasn't using the money for school at all. I brought it up to my parents, thinking they'd be just as frustrated as I was. Instead, they waved it off. "She's young. Let her enjoy life," my mom said. My dad told me, "You can afford it. What's the big deal?" The big deal was that I was working long hours, making sacrifices, and being responsible while she was living it up on my dime. I let it go for a while, but recently, my company gave me a raise. Nothing crazy, but enough to make a difference in my savings. The first thing my parents said when they found out, "You should start giving your sister more." I laughed, thinking they were joking. They weren't. They actually expected me to double what I was giving her. I told them no, I already gave more than enough, and if my sister needed more money, she could get a part-time job like every other college student. That did not go over well. My mom immediately launched into a guilt trip about how family takes care of each other and how I was being selfish. My dad chimed in with the classic, "You're lucky to have a good job. Don't forget where you came from." My sister, of course, acted like I had just ruined her life. She said I was stingy and that I didn't want to see her succeed. She even told me that if I wasn't going to help, I should at least cover specific things for her, like her rent or a car payment, because apparently in her mind, those were now my responsibilities too. Then came the comparisons. My parents started bringing up other relatives who help out their families more. One cousin in particular was their golden example. He paid for his parents' mortgage. My parents weren't even asking for that much, so why was I being so difficult? I pointed out that our cousin was married, had a dual income, and actually wanted to help his parents, whereas I was being pressured into it. That just made them angrier. Then they dropped the bombshell. "If you won't support your sister, we'll have to rethink our relationship with you." That was the moment I realized just how far they were willing to go. It wasn't a request, it was an ultimatum. I felt cornered. No matter what I said, they had an answer ready to make me feel guilty. If I kept giving, they'd keep demanding more. If I refused, I'd be the bad guy. So I talked to a friend about it, someone who isn't emotionally involved. I laid everything out, and the first thing they said was, "Dude, they're taking advantage of you." Hearing it from an outsider hit different. I wasn't just being a good son or brother, I was being used. That's when I started seriously considering cutting off financial support entirely. But I knew if I did that, the backlash would be worse than anything I'd seen so far. The conversation started simple enough. I told my parents I wasn't increasing the amount I gave my sister. That was it. No big speech, no argument, just a firm no. I was expecting some pushback, but I wasn't ready for the full-scale meltdown that followed. My mom's face changed instantly, like I had just told her I was disowning the family. She didn't yell. She didn't even argue. She just sat down, covered her face, and started sobbing. Loud, dramatic, over-the-top sobbing. The kind that made it clear she wanted me to feel every single tear. My dad sat across from me, shaking his head, looking disappointed in a way that somehow felt worse than outright anger. He didn't raise his voice. He just sighed and said things like, "We raised you better than this, and I never thought you'd turn your back on your own family." Meanwhile, my sister wasn't even pretending to be sad. She was furious. She threw her hands in the air, pacing around, talking about how hard things were going to be for her now, how she was going to suffer because I was being selfish. She went on and on about how she couldn't work while being in school full-time, how other people in her class had support from their families, how she had been counting on me. Like her life was somehow ruined because I wasn't doubling the free money she'd been getting. I let them all talk, waiting for a break in the chaos, but there wasn't one. My mom was still crying, my dad was shaking his head, and my sister was listing off every single thing she'd have to give up now that I was cutting her off, which, by the way, I wasn't even doing yet. Then came the real guilt trip. My parents went into full look at everything we've done for you mode. My mom talked about how they struggled when I was little, how they always made sure I had everything I needed even when it was hard. My dad reminded me of the times they picked up extra shifts, the times they put my needs ahead of theirs. They framed it like they had sacrificed everything for me, and now it was my turn to repay them by taking care of my sister. It was exhausting, and then they hit me with the comparisons. Apparently, my cousin, who is married, has a dual-income household, and earns way more than me, helps his parents out. He pays part of their mortgage. And because of that, my parents decided I should be doing the same for them and my sister. It didn't matter that our situations were completely different. In their eyes, I was the bad son, because I wasn't following in his footsteps. I could already feel where this was going, so I ended the conversation. I told them my answer wasn't changing. That's when things really escalated. By the time I got home, the entire extended family knew about what happened. The family group chat was blowing up. Some relatives were on my side, telling me I wasn't responsible for my sister. Others went straight into the family duty argument, saying it's normal to help out, and I was being cold-hearted. Then came the text from my parents. I didn't respond. That's when my sister started posting online. She made vague, passive-aggressive posts about fake family and how some people only care about money. She didn't name names, but it was obvious she was talking about me. People started commenting, agreeing with her, talking about how sad it was when family turned on you. I didn't say anything. I just blocked her. I muted the family chat too. If they wanted to argue, they could do it without me. For the first time in years, I wasn't giving them money. No more transfers, no more helping out, nothing. Then I did something I should have done a long time ago. I went back and calculated exactly how much I had given my sister over the years. I had never added it all up before. Thousands. I had given her thousands of dollars, money that could have gone into my savings, into my future. Instead, it had gone to vacations, designer clothes, and overpriced brunches. That was the moment I knew I had to go all the way, not just refusing the increase, cutting her off completely. But before I could do that, my parents sent me one last message. If you won't step up, we'll find another way. Whatever that meant, I had a feeling this wasn't over. After the last conversation with my parents, things went quiet. Too quiet. No calls, no messages, nothing from my sister either, just silence. For a second, I thought maybe they had finally accepted my decision. Maybe they had realized I wasn't going to budge. Maybe they were actually going to leave me alone. Then, I checked my bank account. I had always monitored my transactions, but I hadn't been checking the small details regularly. When I went through past statements more carefully, I noticed small withdrawals I had overlooked before. Nothing huge, $20 here, $35 there, spaced out over a couple of weeks. It wasn't enough to raise immediate suspicion, but something felt off. I checked further. The withdrawals weren't from anything I recognized. I wasn't spending that money. And the more I looked, the worse it got. The amounts started getting bigger, $50, $100, even a couple of $200 transfers. That's when it hit me. I knew exactly what had happened. I went straight to my bank's transaction history and checked the details. The transfers were going directly to my parents' bank account. They had taken my money. I had once helped set up their automatic bill payments, and I must have forgotten to remove my account from those transactions, something they had clearly taken advantage of. I never thought to change it because I never imagined they'd actually steal from me. I called them immediately. No answer. I called again, straight to voicemail. I kept calling until my dad finally picked up. I didn't even have to explain why I was calling. He already knew. He didn't deny it. He didn't even act surprised. At first, they claimed it was for my sister's expenses, but when I confronted them, the truth slipped out. They had been using the money for their own bills, assuming I wouldn't mind because I had enough. They were planning to pay me back. I told them that if they needed help, they could have asked. Instead, they went behind my back and took my money without permission. Then my sister got on the phone. She wasn't apologetic. She wasn't even embarrassed. She was smug. She told me that since I refused to help, they had no other choice. If I wasn't going to willingly support my family, then they had to do what was necessary. I hung up. I went straight to my bank's security settings, locked my account, and changed every password. I added two-factor authentication, called the bank, and froze my card. I wasn't going to let them take another cent. When I told a friend what happened, they didn't hesitate. That's theft, they said. You should report them. I already knew that, but reporting my own parents, that was something else entirely. Before I even had time to process, my parents called again. This time, they weren't pretending to be innocent. They were furious. How could I lock them out of my account? Why was I acting like they were criminals? Money shouldn't come before family. They had no shame, no regret, no acknowledgement that what they did was wrong. I checked the total amount they had taken. It was over $1,500. That's when I realized this wasn't just desperation. This was entitlement. They actually believed they had the right to my money. Then the family backlash started. Somehow, word got out that I was threatening to have my own mother arrested over a little money. My phone started blowing up with messages from relatives. Some of them tried to be neutral, telling me I needed to talk things out with my parents. Others went full attack mode, calling me selfish, ungrateful, and accusing me of abandoning my family. The worst part, my parents didn't even try to deny what they did. Instead, they spun it. They told everyone they had no choice but to take the money because I was being cruel and hoarding my income instead of helping the family. They made it seem like they were struggling just to survive, that I had forced them into this. It wasn't true. They weren't drowning in debt. They weren't about to lose their home. My dad still had his job. My mom still had hers. My sister still had her apartment, still had her designer bags, still had the same lifestyle. They just wanted more. One relative actually sided with me. My uncle, the same one who had warned me before. He sent me a message saying he had been in my shoes before, that my parents had used him the same way years ago. He told me to cut them off now before they ruined my future like they almost ruined his. I thought about it. I had already locked them out of my bank account. I had stopped giving them money, but the truth was, if I let this slide, they would try again. Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but eventually they'd find another way. Then my parents sent me one final text. If you really don't want to be part of this family, then fine. I stared at the screen, knowing this was another manipulation tactic. But this time, I wasn't sure if I even cared. After my parents sent that last text, if you really don't want to be part of this family, then fine. Kent, I didn't respond. For the first time, I let the silence sit. A day passed, then another. Then a full week, No calls, no messages, no guilt trips. But it didn't last. My uncle, the same one who warned me before, called. He didn't waste time with small talk. He told me straight up, this won't stop unless you stop it. You have to decide what kind of life you want. He wasn't wrong. I had been making excuses, hoping they'd change, thinking maybe they'd realize what they did was wrong. But they weren't sorry. They weren't even pretending to be. I was still processing that conversation when my sister texted, not to apologize, not to check in, just a demand for money. She first acted indifferent when I asked about the money, brushing it off with vague answers, but when I finally refused to send more, she suddenly started calling it her allowance, as if she had been entitled to it all along. When I didn't respond, she kept going, said I was being selfish, that I owed her for being successful while she was still in school. She wasn't even pretending to be polite anymore. Then came my parents. They didn't ask about the stolen money. They didn't even acknowledge the bank account situation. They first demanded more money, then stole from me, and now, as if nothing had happened, they dismissed my anger as overreacting. Like their betrayal was just a minor inconvenience, instead of outright fraud. I was being petty for getting upset over something that wasn't that serious. And then, the emotional hook. My mom sent an old childhood picture of us together. Just the two of us back when I was a kid. No words, just the picture. I didn't respond. A few hours later, my cousin messaged me. The one I actually trust. He told me what my parents had been saying behind my back. They were telling everyone I was a selfish, greedy brat, that I was hoarding money while my family suffered, that I had abandoned them after everything they'd done for me. I checked my bank statements again. I thought they had taken around $1,500, but I was wrong. Going back further, looking at small withdrawals I hadn't noticed before, the real number was closer to $3,000. That was it. That was the moment the anger kicked in. If anyone else had stolen that much money from me, I would have reported them without hesitation. So why was I letting family get away with it? I didn't plan it. I just got in my car, drove straight to their house, and knocked on the door. They looked surprised to see me, not guilty, not ashamed, just surprised. I walked in, pulled out the printed bank statements, and put them on the table. I told them I wanted the money back. Every cent. My dad laughed. Actually laughed. He smirked, leaned back in his chair, and said, "You're acting like we robbed a bank. It's just family money. Like it was no big deal. Like it was something I should just accept." My sister was there too. She rolled her eyes, made some comment about how I was just bitter because I didn't have a real life like her. No apology, no remorse. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't going to stop. They weren't going to change. They saw me as a walking paycheck. I stood up and said the words I should have said a long time ago. "This is the last time I'm speaking to you until you pay me back." Silence. Then my mom lost it. She screamed that I was tearing the family apart over something so small, that I was choosing money over blood, that I was turning my back on the people who raised me. I didn't stay to argue. I didn't stay to explain. I walked out the door without looking back. As I closed it behind me, I could still hear my mom crying. I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart pounding. Had I just made the biggest mistake of my life, or the best decision ever? For the first time in years, my phone was completely silent. No calls, no guilt-tripping messages, no sister demanding her allowance. At first, it felt strange. My parents had always been in my ear about something: money, family obligations, reminders that I was lucky to have a good job. But now, nothing. Then my sister started posting online. It was the same passive-aggressive nonsense as before. But this time, she doubled down. She posted about fake family and how greed ruins relationships. Her friends in the comments backed her up, saying how sad it was when money changed people. She never mentioned me by name, but everyone knew. It didn't stop there. The family group chat exploded. A few aunts messaged me saying I was being cruel for refusing to help my sister when I had so much. They said family was supposed to support each other, not abandon each other over a few dollars. Some cousins, on the other hand, were on my side. One of them told me I did the right thing, saying, "You know, she wasn't struggling. She just didn't want to get a job." Then I heard the real reason why my parents were so desperate for my money. Through a family friend, I found out my dad's job wasn't doing well. There were layoffs coming, and he was already struggling with bills. That explained everything. They weren't just using my money for my sister's expenses. They were relying on it to keep themselves afloat. A few days later, the silence ended. My mom called from an unknown number. It started with begging. "Just talk. Fix this before it's too late." Then came the fake apology. She didn't say they were wrong. She didn't admit to taking my money. She just said, "We're sorry you feel this way, but you have to understand where we're coming from." Then my dad jumped in. He admitted they took the money, but only because they were desperate. He said they knew I wouldn't have noticed. It wasn't that much, and they were planning to pay me back eventually. I told them they could have asked. They could have told me the truth instead of stealing from me. They ignored that part. Meanwhile, my sister was still running her mouth online. Instead of staying quiet, she mocked me in another post. She talked about how she was glad she had real family who supported her, unlike some people who let money control them. She had no idea that my parents had admitted to stealing. Then I got another notification. Someone had tried to access my old bank account. Luckily, the account had already been locked, but the attempt came from a location I recognized. My parents' house. They were still trying to take my money. That was it. I changed everything. New passwords. Two-factor authentication on everything. Fraud alerts. I called my bank again and made sure they had no way of accessing anything connected to me. Then I sent a final message. If they ever tried to take money from me again, I'd go to the police. They didn't respond, but the family backlash started up again almost immediately. My parents told everyone that I was threatening to have my own mother arrested. The group chat turned into a war zone. Some family members told me I was overreacting. Others finally saw the truth. Then something unexpected happened. A few extended relatives privately messaged me. People I barely talked to. They told me they had been through the same thing. My parents had borrowed money from them years ago and never paid it back. My sister had done the same thing, acting entitled, expecting handouts, never working for anything. Then my coworker suggested something I hadn't thought of before. A lawyer. Not for anything extreme, just to protect myself legally, to make sure they couldn't do anything worse. That was the moment it clicked. This wasn't just about money. This was a toxic pattern that would never stop unless I stopped it. After hearing what my parents had been saying to the family and the fact that they tried accessing my old bank account, I decided to do something I never thought I'd do. I met with a lawyer. At first, it was just to understand my options. I wasn't looking to go nuclear, but I wanted to know how serious this was legally. It turned out my parents hadn't just taken my money, they had committed financial fraud. Taking money from my account without permission? Fraud. Trying to open a credit card in my name? Identity theft. That last part hit me hard. I had checked my credit score before, but now, I dug deeper. Sure enough, there was a recent denied credit card application under my name. They had actually tried to open a credit card using my identity. The lawyer laid it out plainly. I had enough evidence to press charges, and in hindsight, I should have acted sooner. Banks don't take identity fraud lightly, and my hesitation had already given them too much leeway. Did I really want to go this far? Did I want to involve the law against my own parents? Before I could even process it all, my sister messaged me. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't regret. She mocked me. Wow, you're really gonna ruin our family over some change. Change. That was her takeaway from all this. Thousands of dollars stolen. Fraud attempts in my name. And to her, it was pocket change. That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with misunderstandings or desperation. They truly believed they could do whatever they wanted with my money. I printed everything, the bank statements, the text messages, the social media posts, even the evidence of the credit card attempt. If I was going to make a move, I wanted everything documented. Then I sent one last message to my parents. Either pay me back or I'm pressing charges. Silence. No guilt trips. No angry rants. Just silence. I started wondering if they were finally scared. If they knew I was serious. A few days later my mom called, but this time she didn't beg. She didn't cry. She told me the family wanted to have a meeting. They wanted to work things out in person. I wasn't stupid. I knew what this was, but I agreed. On one condition, I was bringing a friend with me. Someone who wasn't family. Someone who would witness everything. They weren't happy about it, but they didn't argue. When I arrived at their house, the atmosphere was tense. My parents were seated, looking serious. My sister was there too, scrolling on her phone like she didn't care. The second I sat down, my dad started talking. Not about the stolen money, not about what they had done. Instead, he flipped the script. I was the one destroying the family. I was the one being selfish. I was putting money over blood. It wasn't about what they did anymore. They were making me the bad guy. My mom leaned in, voice trembling. She grabbed my hands, tears welling up in her eyes. Don't you love us anymore? It was a performance. Every word, every look, carefully calculated. That was when I realized, this wasn't just about money. It never had been. This was about control. They weren't sorry. They just didn't like losing access to me. I stood up. I love you, but I'm not your bank. And then I walked out. I heard my mom start crying again as I left. My dad didn't say a word. My sister didn't even look up from her phone. By the time I got home, I had one last message waiting for me. A long, angry text from my dad. If you walk away now, don't expect to ever come back. That was it. That was the final straw. I blocked their numbers, deleted them from social media, cut them off completely. For the first time in my life, I felt free. No more guilt, no more obligations. Just me, my life, and my future. And the biggest realization, family is about love and respect, not financial obligation. For the first time in years, everything was quiet. No messages, no missed calls, no guilt trips. Just silence. Blocking my parents, my sister, and most of the family chat had wiped out all the usual drama. At first it felt strange, like something was missing, but after a few days that feeling faded, replaced by something else. Peace. But it didn't last. A week later, the messages started coming in, not from my parents, not from my sister, but from distant relatives I barely spoke to. Some were confused, others were outright angry. How could you abandon your family? Your parents are struggling, and you turned your back on them. This isn't how family is supposed to work. I knew exactly where this was coming from. My parents had started a smear campaign. They told everyone that I had cut them off without reason, that I was hoarding money while they suffered, that I had become cold and heartless. I ignored the messages. Then my sister went off online. She didn't hold back this time. Long, dramatic posts about how greed ruins relationships, how some people only care about money, how family means nothing to them. She had her friends hyping her up in the comments, saying things like "you deserve better," and some people forget who was there for them. Like I hadn't just spent years funding her lifestyle. Again, I ignored it. Then my mom sent one last message, from a new number: "If you have any heart left, come home and talk to us." Still no mention of the money, no apology, no owning up to what they did. Just another guilt trip. I didn't respond, but something told me to check my credit report again. I had locked everything down after they tried to access my old account, but I still had a bad feeling, and I was right. There it was. Another attempt to open a credit card in my name. This time they had applied at a different bank. Thankfully, it was denied. But that didn't change the fact that they were still trying to steal from me. This wasn't just about emotional manipulation anymore. This was identity theft. That was the moment I realized I had to stop giving them chances. I met with my lawyer again, showed him everything. The bank statements, the credit report, the texts, even the social media posts. I asked what my options were. He didn't even hesitate. "This is fraud. If you report this, they will take it seriously." I wasn't ready to press full charges, but I filed the fraud report. A few days later, my parents got a formal warning from the authorities. That's when the panic set in. My mom called from another new number, sobbing, saying I was trying to have my own father arrested. She begged me to take it back, said they had only done it because they were desperate. I didn't answer. Then the family group chat exploded again. Half the family was still blaming me, saying I should have handled this privately, saying I was taking things too far. Over time, more relatives started questioning things. Some still took my parents' side, but others, especially those who had lent them money before, began seeing the pattern. The ones who had believed my parents' lies were now questioning things. They started asking for proof. They started realizing my parents weren't victims. Then I got a message from someone unexpected. An aunt I barely talked to. She told me she knew exactly what I was going through. My parents had borrowed money from her too. Thousands. Years ago. And they had never paid her back. This wasn't new behavior. They had been doing this for a long time. Then came the final betrayal. One of my cousins told me the truth. My sister knew about the credit card fraud. Not only did she know, she encouraged it. She actually told my parents to try again because she was sure I wouldn't notice. That was it. The final wake-up call. This wasn't just toxic parents. This wasn't just a spoiled sister. This was a family built on financial manipulation. I wasn't just dealing with a one-time mistake. This was a pattern, a cycle, and it was never going to stop unless I stopped it. The next day, I made my decision. I called my lawyer and told him to move forward with a restraining order. No more warnings. No more chances. This time, I was protecting myself. Filing the restraining order felt surreal. The paperwork was straightforward. My lawyer made sure of that, but the weight of it hit differently. This wasn't just blocking their numbers or ignoring messages. This was legal proof that I was done. The order barred my parents from accessing any of my personal or financial information. No more attempts to open credit cards in my name. No more sneaky withdrawals. No more excuses. I expected backlash. I wasn't disappointed. My sister lost it. The message was long, paragraphs upon paragraphs of insults. She called me a pathetic excuse for a brother, told me I was ruining her life, and even accused me of enjoying their suffering. I didn't respond. Then I found out my parents had moved on to their next target. A cousin messaged me out of nowhere. They had started guilt-tripping him for money. Same tactics, same lines. Family helps each other. Don't you want to support your own blood? Only this time, the family was catching on. More and more relatives started piecing things together. People who had believed their sob story now saw the pattern. It wasn't just me. They had been doing this for years. Some stopped returning their calls. Some outright cut contact. They were running out of people to manipulate. Then came the biggest shift. My sister's life started to unravel. Without my money covering her lifestyle, she had to start making changes. She eventually took a part-time job, though she made sure everyone knew how unfair it was that she had to work. It wasn't anything glamorous, just basic retail, and she hated it. The dramatic post continued. Imagine having to work when your family should be supporting you. Some people really have no shame. Again, she didn't say my name, but everyone knew. Then my mom sent one last email. "One day you'll regret treating us like this." I deleted it without reading further. For the first time in years, I wasn't responsible for anyone but myself. It felt strange. I had spent so long budgeting with them in mind, worrying about their demands, waiting for the next financial crisis they would throw on me. Now, nothing. Then something happened that I never saw coming. My job offered me a promotion, not just a raise, a full relocation, across the country. I thought about it for maybe 5 minutes before accepting. This was my chance. No more accidental run-ins. No more wondering if they'd show up at my door. No more family drama. A clean slate. But before I could leave, one last thing came up. A family reunion. I debated skipping it. I had no interest in seeing my parents, but my uncle, the one who had supported me from the start, convinced me to go. You should show up. Let them see you don't need them. Let them see you won. So I went. The second I walked in, I knew they weren't expecting me. My parents froze. My sister's face twisted like she had just swallowed something sour. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. But then, something strange happened. They acted like nothing ever happened. My mom smiled, came toward me with open arms, like she was about to hug me. My dad gave a small nod, as if we were just casually catching up. Like they hadn't spent the last few months smearing my name. Like they hadn't stolen from me. Like they hadn't tried to commit identity fraud. And then my mom spoke. "We need to put this behind us and act like a family again," my mom said. Her voice light, as if we hadn't spent months locked in a battle over their betrayal. The entire room got quiet. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cause a scene. I just looked at her and said, "You mean like how you tried to steal from me?" "No thanks." Silence. The color drained from my mom's face. My dad's jaw tightened. My sister looked down at her phone like she wished she could disappear. Every single person in that room had just heard the truth. People started whispering. The same relatives who had blamed me were now looking at my parents like they were seeing them for the first time. They had spent months playing the victims. Now, they were exposed. I didn't stay long after that. I had made my point. As I walked out, I knew this was the last time they would ever manipulate me again. A year, 12 full months of silence. No calls, no guilt trips, no financial demands. Moving across the country was the best decision I ever made. For the first time, I was actually living for myself. No more budgeting with my family in mind. No more anxiety every time my phone buzzed. Just peace. But while I was thriving, my sister wasn't, without my money propping up her lifestyle. Reality hit her hard. She dropped out of college. She had no financial backup. No one else to cover her rent, her shopping, her vacations. She ended up working full-time in retail, something she had once called pathetic. The same job she looked down on, now it was her only option, and she hated it. Meanwhile, my parents were still playing the victims. They told anyone who would listen that I had abandoned them, that I had ruined the family. But this time, fewer people believed them. After what happened at the reunion, most of the extended family had stopped helping them financially. They saw the pattern. They saw what my parents had done not just to me, but to others. The money stream dried up, and it showed. I heard from a cousin that they were struggling, bills piling up, barely scraping by. The same financial mess they had always been in. The difference? They had no one left to use. Meanwhile, my life had never been better. I bought a new car, started investing seriously. For the first time in my adult life, I was saving for myself. Even in relationships, things changed. I started dating again, and this time, no secrets. I didn't have to worry about explaining why a chunk of my paycheck disappeared every month. I didn't have to feel guilty for spending my money on myself. Then one day, an email popped up in my inbox. It was from my mom. "I miss you. Family should come first." No apology, no mention of what they did. Just a carefully worded attempt to pull me back in. I sat there, staring at the screen. Had she really changed? Or were they just out of money again? I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Then I found out about my sister's new scheme. Since she couldn't manipulate me anymore, she moved on to our grandparents. A cousin told me she had been begging them for money, using the same lines she used on me. "I'm in a tough spot. Family is supposed to help. It's just a little bit. I'll pay you back." She wasn't struggling enough to change. She was just looking for a new paycheck. But my grandparents, they weren't buying it. After everything that had happened, they had finally seen her for who she was, and they cut her off too. As for my parents, things kept getting worse. With no financial lifelines left, the life they had built on other people's money was collapsing. No savings, no backup plan, no more excuses. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. I realized that cutting them off wasn't cruel, it was necessary. If I had kept giving in, if I had kept playing along, I would have spent my entire life funding their irresponsibility. I thought about how different my life would have been if I had never stood up for myself. If I had kept caving, kept giving, kept letting them drain me dry. I closed my laptop, took a deep breath. For the first time ever, I felt zero guilt, no regrets, no second guessing, just peace. And for once, it was mine to keep.